Bishop Enoch is expected to be on later. And this is, the Orthodox Apologetics channel. We're in our break, so we take, kind of like, we do our show kind of like haphazardly until after Theophany. So I'd like to welcome everyone who's listening. Welcome everyone who is available. And tonight we have Sean Ridlon on. Sean's contributed to our comment sections, but we, and he's a, overall great, good Orthodox Christian. Nice to have you on, Sean.
Thanks a lot, Deacon. I appreciate it.
And so tonight, what we're going to be talking about is an interesting subject. It was the bishop's idea to look at various different heterodox groups, talk to former members, and then talk to current members and have dialogue with them, debate, etc. That part won't be happening tonight because I'm still looking at that I guess the Fair Mormon website. Just to give a little background, Sean, you're a former member of the Mormon Church, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't get any more heterodox than that.
No, it don't. Well, I guess there's also Mormon sects so I guess theoretically, well, I'll let you talk because I was never there. So, in any case, tell us how this started. Were you raised Mormon?
Yeah, I was. My father was from New England, and his, parents were, very irreligious. My mother's family were immigrants from Central Europe, and were also very irreligious. And when my parents conceived me, they weren't married at first, and then, they became married, and then sort of saw this like a lack of, moral authority and sort of a bigger picture in their life that they wanted for their kids. They felt like that was lacking. And about that time, my mother was homesick and pregnant, and there was a knock at the door, and it was the Mormon missionaries, and that's how it happened. So I was born Mormon.
Okay. All right. So this is going to lead to the first question, because a lot of people outside of, the missionaries knocking on the door have very little contact or exposure with Mormonism. Can you tell us a little more about the sort of lifestyle and for our Orthodox listeners, what makes it different? There's a lot of things. Obviously, we haven't touched the beliefs, but just to get an idea of your background.
Well, I think, the things that are most important to Mormons, or the things that are important to remember about Mormons, is Mormons self-identify as Christians. Officially their church, the name of their church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is a lengthy name. It's not the first name they ever had. It's not the only name they've ever gone under. But if you, as an Orthodox Christian, try to rationalize with them that, they don't even hold the creed in common with Christianity, they'll simply retort, well, look, it's in the name. So that's the first thing to remember about Mormons, is that they self-identify as Christian. Second is that probably they're unique in the religious landscape in that Mormons are a purely American phenomenon, that this is where they're from. And, as far as American contributions to the religious landscape, this is, one of the big ones. So there's a kind of a special relationship between Mormonism and the United States of America that has proved difficult in everything from them proselytizing to the Native Americans, all the way to, here in the modern age, outside of North America, becomes problematic. So they have a very peculiar way of looking at North America, as both the place that was the Garden of Eden and would constitute a new Zion, in their Chiliastic viewpoint.
Wait, hold on. I didn't get. So do they believe the Garden of Eden's in North America?
Yeah, literally in Missouri.
I did not know that. Okay, continue. Yes. Sorry about that. Wow.
Right. So the Book of Mormon, to them, they don't have a closed canon. So if we want to use our church history here, they're can be closely related, to many heretical sects, but One of them is Montanists. So like the Montanists, they believe in the doctrine of progressive revelation, meaning that whatever the Mormon prophet says now, it's like a hyper ex cathedra. In other words, like it supersedes everything, including the words of Christ.
Wow.
And it can be something he says on a conference call, like if there's more than one witness. It can be something that he, publishes in a letter to a children's magazine. Now, they're not known for radical changes in doctrine quickly, but over time, it allows the Mormons to be. It's tough. It's like nailing Jello to the wall. If you try to nail one down that you're talking with about what is it you believe, I read you believe this. They can really reach into their bag and pull out anything and say, well, at General Conference in 2014, the prophet said this, and so now that's invalid. So they can be very, very hard to deal with in that respect. But that sets them apart from other religious sects that come out of the Second Great Awakening and out of the American frontier religious landscape. So those are a couple peculiar things about them, that I think sort of set them apart from like Protestants or evangelicals that a lot of us are used to dealing with.
Okay. All right. So that's interesting. Now they have there's a few different unique teachings that they have. I know one of them is this the word of wisdom. That one struck me. Is that like you can't drink Coca-Cola? Well, you can drink soda, but there's a few that you know it better than I do. If you could explain.
Yeah, the word of wisdom is an interesting doctrine. It's one that kind of Mormons are known for because it causes not friction, but more or less curiosity with people that are outside of Mormonism. What's interesting is how the word of wisdom, came into the church. So different religious groups have, food laws. I mean, whether we're talking about like, Jewish ceremonial food laws, right? Or, Nation of Islam has, a salubrious living, where they eat a lot of bean pies and that kind of thing. There's different groups have these things to make them peculiar.
Well, even the church has fasts, so I understand.
Well, sure, yeah, that's a good example, and we could talk about Mormon fasting because that's another topic too. We might circle back on, but the word of wisdom itself, it was not an original Mormon teaching. So the Mormon Church was pretty well launched about 1830, but in 1833, the word of wisdom began to get circulated amongst at least the higher ups in the church, wherein like the Lord was supposed to have revealed foods which are good to eat and ones that weren't. And some of the wording, of course, alcoholic drinks, tobacco, tea and coffee, although like you could point out that like it doesn't actually say tea or coffee. It says that hot drinks are not for the throat. Now,
so that's like Theraflu's out.
Right. It's a very obscure thing. Like, what does that mean? There's some Mormon apologists and critics who have pointed out that Joseph Smith's parents operated a tea house in rural New York, which in those days, a tea house was pretty much the same thing as a bar.
Yeah.
That he had like an aversion to the people that would come there and take that. There's other sort of apocryphal tales from the origins of the word of wisdom that actually say that it was his first wife who objected to the passing of the jug and the spitting of tobacco on her floor when this small church.
I read about that.
Yeah. So even when you're Mormon, you're like, okay, where did this come from? What's funny is when you say Coke or soda, when in the 1970s and maybe it was the late 60s, I think it was possibly even National Geographic magazine came out with this article about how caffeine was an addictive substance, how it could cause dependence and pressure. And the Mormons at the time because I mean, Joseph Smith, regardless of the origin of this, never has said anything about Coca-Cola. Okay, so what happened was in the 60s and 70s when this was written, in scientific journals and everything, and became popularly known, like Mormons of the time said, "Aha, he's a prophet," and the evidence is that he didn't want us to drink caffeine because it was addictive, and so they used that as like proving to themselves that this was an inspired commandment. Now then, what we see here in the early 2000s is that caffeine is actually a mental stimulant and increases IQ. And so now Mormons, a lot of them imbibe caffeine, although they do not, drink coffee or tea.
Right. So that's why I noticed that. I mean, I've dealt with occasional missionaries over the years, and one of the biggest things I noticed that was different from the first missionaries I met, which would have been in the early 90s, to ones I met in the 2000s, is that the ones in the 2000s had made it very clear that they were okay with drinking soda. So
right. So what you've witnessed is the malleability of Mormon doctrine, the importance of, these ongoing revelations, where if a Mormon leader in the 2000s say, "Hey, come on, caffeine is Diet Coke really the worst thing?" Then all of a sudden everybody's like, "Okay, well that supersedes everything that we've done before now." Okay. So like I said, it can make them very hard to nail down.
Okay, so now you were a Mormon until when? Because I want to get to your life story, and then I want to ask more questions about the religion itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was officially in the Mormon faith until I was 17 years old.
Okay.
Okay. So so that would be almost 30 years ago. 27 years.
Okay.
And so my official exit from the Mormon faith was, due to, like a lifetime of kind of doubting and everything. But, at the same time, I was going through some things and was reprimanded by a lay preacher they call him a bishop. So he administrates one of the organizational tiers of the church called a ward. So every ward has a bishop, and then every stake has a stake president, and so on. And so our local bishop, they can sort of do this confessional with you, and he'd have some reports of some things that I was up to, because by 17 I was really rebelling and doing things that even as an Orthodox Christian I probably shouldn't have been doing. But so they disfellowshipped me. Yeah, well, I was, and part of my upbringing, sort of the mindset that you have when you're Mormon, led this to be maybe worse than it would be for somebody who was maybe raised with no religion even. I don't know. But so like when I was 17, I was disfellowshipped, which is like I wasn't allowed to participate in the ordinances of the church, and I wasn't allowed to like do my job. And at the time, I was a priest, which was my rank.
At 17?
Well, you remember every 19-year-old missionary you've spoken to is an elder.
You're right. Now, can you explain?
Try that.
I know what it is, but our listeners might not. If you could explain the two kinds of priests, so just real quick, so that they understand that.
So there's what's called the Aaronic priesthood, named after the brother of Moses, Aaron. And then there's the Melchizedek priesthood, which is named after, Melchizedek, who was a type of Christ, prefiguring of Christ in the Bible. But that's where they took the names from. And so when I was 8 years old, I received the Aaronic priesthood. And at that time, I was called a deacon. I'm sorry, I was 12. I was 12 when I became a deacon. And then at 14, I became a teacher, was my rank. And then at 16, I became a priest, or a priest. And then you become an elder. And then after that, most Mormon men remain at that level of elder. And they call each other brother, not usually elder, once they're sort of in the rank and file. But above that are high priests. And then above the high priests are the apostles. And there's, of course, 12 of them. And then the presidency of the church.
Well, one thing I will say about the missionaries with the elder thing is it's pretty efficient that they use the last name, because you can't really talk to them on a first name basis because of that. It's otherwise you're just calling him Mr. Johnson or something. It's so that's an interesting and tricky thing. But
they're very good at that. They've had a lot of practice. The Mormon practice of sending forth missionaries into the world really began in 1831. So and that was, we can cover that if you want to talk about sort of the history of the church of that church. But
yeah,
we could probably get that in a minute. But yeah, they've got a lot of practice, so they know what they're doing.
Okay, so you're 17, you're rebelling, you're as a teenager. It sounds like they excommunicated you, basically.
Well, excommunication is a different form, and my father was actually excommunicated when I was 26.
Really?
Yeah, and so he was up to something completely unrelated, on his own. But he was a high priest, so what he had done involved him not submitting to basically like a Mormon Sharia court, and refusing to do what they said, and so he was excommunicated and given over to the bufferings of Satan as one of the
so that's like
terminologies.
so like basically, like, I mean, I hate to draw the parallel, but it's like the difference between excommunication and anathema, basically.
Yeah, because you're also considered spiritually dead. Like, your soul at that point is dead. Your body's alive, but your soul is dead. So it goes further.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very serious for a Mormon.
And I don't want to pry. Was it a serious moral issue, or was it just a thing that they were just?
Yeah, I mean, it was a serious Mormon moral issue, but I mean, more important was it wasn't for that. Like, really, people with the same issue have been allowed to remain in the church, and including in their positions of leadership, maybe with some tarnish, to those positions. But it was that he refused to submit to them.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, yeah, it was bad. I'm not trying to make him out like a folk hero or anything, but that made it so when I started to, have religious feelings of my own, that were really my own for really the first time in my life, Mormonism was just off the table. I mean, to be quite honest, I went back to the Mormon church exactly one time, and I made it for about 45 minutes, and then I was like, there's no way I can do this, and I just left. And then, I became an Orthodox catechumen.
Wow. Explain the jump, because that's quite the jump.
Well, I had, almost, over 20 years of time between when I walked out of Mormonism, wanting nothing to do with it, and, going through stages that a lot of people go through, my God is right out here in the woods with me on my four-wheeler, to, just like having all these different ideas about what God is and how does it interact with me. Is God real? And those sorts of things. And when of course, Mormons, one thing that messed me up, and we can go over the things I think that messed me up a little bit from Mormonism.
Sure.
One was that a common Mormon tactic when you're talking to them is that one of the Mormon articles of faith says that we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as long as it is translated correctly. Okay, we believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God and so forth. Okay, but the most important part of that is as long as it is translated correctly. So which translation are they talking about? The answer is none of them. Joseph Smith never completed his rendering, his corrections of the Bible. So you're raised to not believe the Bible at all, that everything in the Bible has been tampered with to, minimize the amount of Mormonism in the Bible, because Mormons believe everybody in the Bible is Mormon, including Adam and Jesus Christ and Moses. So all of this has been hidden from you by, typical Protestant, nonsense. They took that to say that the church has been completely corrupted, and including the Bible. So, when you're
you can't trust anything.
You can't trust anything about it. Yeah. So before I ever even became Orthodox, I had ordered, in fact, even before the internet really, I had ordered a lot of apocryphal books and read them. when the internet came around. I read a lot of other apocryphal works. And like, because I was raised that the Bible was pretty much always wrong, and the, there was this open canon, like I was pretty messed up. So that's why it took me so long, but I was obsessed with, like, someone who was raised in a Restorationist movement church, like the LDS. I was obsessed with the early church and trying to find it. And in trying to determine if the Bible was true, I just began with the question of, was the resurrection genuine? Was it historical? Was the accounts of it accurate? Because I figured out that I was never going to be able to track down the 9 lepers who didn't come back to Christ, much less, these men were gone. I wasn't going to be able to track down these witnesses that are mentioned, so I was going to have to go with something central, something big. And when I was convinced that the resurrection was, a true event, a true fact, well, then everything else had to be real. It just followed. And I had made that deal with myself that if I could convince myself of that, looking at it critically, then I would need to try to find that church. And then at that point, there was, only a couple of candidates. It was very easy at that point to become Orthodox.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a lot of things.
A couple of people are commenting, so I'm gonna throw that out because some of them are interesting. This one comes from Archel White. It says, it just came out by BYU scholars that the Joseph Smith translation was plagiarized. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Not in particular. I don't keep up with what comes out of BYU anymore. My mother was actually a professor at BYU. Now she's no longer there. She's at a tuition. But it might be interesting to mention here that 6 children, and out of all of us in my family, we already mentioned my father is excommunicated. My mother is still LDS. My youngest brother is LDS. And I have one sister who, after her 3rd marriage, if you count the common law marriage that she had, has come back to Mormonism. So not a lot of us stayed with it, at all. When we say plagiarize, I mean, it's Mormonism. This is typical of Mormonism. Like, for instance, the first vision of Joseph Smith, which he reported various dates and ages at which he experienced this apparent, vision, which told him not to join any church, but the new church, the real church, would be revealed through him. That was 1820. That's a various date, but no Mormon who was converted between then and 1830 ever heard about it. The first vision is something that was literally written into Mormon history beginning around 1830. And so this is typical of Mormonism. You'll never nail them down or get anything true out of them. And almost every claim they make is falsifiable by an objective standard. So, that's a good point, but that's normal for them.
Now, what's interesting is I decided to Google this, and apparently I found a website called ldsdiscussions.com, where they're really actually saying that was basically, they couldn't conclude it's anything but plagiarism. But it's fascinating. I'll put a link to it in the group, that's listening, because it's granted, now, as you've noted, it's kind of a moving canon. So in a sense, they can admit to that, and it's like, oh well, but that's problematic when you're talking about the founder and first prophet of your church.
No, not at all. And I'll tell you why. If a common Mormon tactic is is for them to ask you, like, if I was a Mormon missionary and you just said that, I would say, well, yeah, Deacon, who is the most important prophet? And you might say Joseph, that's my saint name. And Vladika may say Enoch because that's his. And then they would say, no, it's the one that's living right now.
Oh yeah, I think I've actually heard that once. I thought the greatest prophet was John the Baptist, in my personal opinion. That's just me. But
right. Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing they do. So Joseph Smith, they put on par with Moses or Enoch or John the Baptist, but the one that's living now is more important. So whatever, see what I mean? So it's not when you said what you just said that, yeah, they respect him. He's the founder or whatever, but that he's not who's calling the shots right now, not by a long shot, you know?
So now it sounds almost like a quasi papacy, and I've seen kind of that sort of arguments before between Roman Catholics and Mormons, that basically the offices of the Pope and the office of the prophet are basically, they're not identical, but they're fairly close in the sense of an infallible ruler that kind of, speaks with the voice of the Holy Spirit, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. That's well, yeah. What Joseph Smith was trying to fashion his, so-called presidency on. We can look at the things he wrote and make a lot of guesses, but had he encountered Roman Catholicism? Probably not. Actually, he had probably encountered it through, different Reformed writings and things that were common and at his time, and also maybe through speakers in the Second Great Awakening. The area that he was from, Palmyra, New York, was located in what they today call the burned over district, which they call it that because it was burned over by the fires of revival so many times. So like, I want to give you an example of that. So like, you're familiar with the Millerites.
Yeah.
So it was 1833 in northeastern New York, in which William Miller, decided that he had his first vision also, was there, and that, the world was going to end in 1834. So Mormons began to pack their bags and move west in 1831 from New York. So there's also, the peculiar garments that the Millerites wore, at the Great Disappointment when they were awaiting this rapture, that became the Mormon garments. Do you see what I mean?
Really?
Yeah, they're absolute. They are all connected. All of these groups that come from this area, when they came to Ohio in 1831, the size of their congregation doubled when a Campbellite preacher named Sidney Rigdon brought in a couple of hundred people that had been part of the Campbellite movement. That's called the Church of Christ today. So when they came in, then they started to take on this frontier flavor, this restorationist flavor. But before that, they were just like Millerites and all this other.
Now, just out of curiosity, is this stuff that you learned about when you were young, or is this stuff you learned about later?
Yeah, absolutely not. No, you don't learn about any of this. But this is where things get, which you a little sympathetic, for the people that are still involved in Mormonism and groups like this, is what you're taught is that you are going to believe as a Mormon something that nobody is going to believe you. When you say it, they're all going to laugh at you. But that's just a test. Like if you make this wild historical claim, somebody's going to say that that's wrong, and they're going to show you, that, through archaeology or, things that everybody already knows, they're going to prove you wrong, that that's a test, and that you just have to respond with, I know the church is true and Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. So while Joseph Smith never encountered a Roman Catholic, more than likely, he was familiar with caricatures of Roman Catholic structure, which he clearly mimicked. The other one he mimicked was Islam. So he saw himself as the prophet, a lot like Muhammad, and he said very flattering things about Muhammad, at least what he knew about Muhammad.
Actually, that leads me to one thing that I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about, and I'm going to get to the next big comment, which I think is interesting, which is, are a lot of Mormons also Freemasons? Now, I don't know that that's the case, but I do know that there's some history behind that. If you can enlighten us on that.
Yeah. Okay. So, to answer the listener, Mormons are not a part of the Freemason movement, in that Mormons are disallowed to join any secret combination or group like that. So if you're a Mormon who is a Mason, you could be excommunicated. Now, that being said, Mormon's particular view of history is that God is revealing, that the truth, of Mormonism has been perverted into all these different things, not just churches. So when a Mormon looks at the Orthodox Church, they see a perverted version of Mormonism. And if they can see similarities, then they think that that's just a remnant of your Mormonism. That they look at the Freemasons the same way. Now, that's how they look at it. But in reality, Mormonism borrowed heavily from Freemasonry. Like, that's undisputable, but Mormons will dispute it, because that's what they do. But, a Mormon can't be a Freemason. A Mormon feels like he belongs to the real Great White Lodge, the Mormon Church. Like, it's corrected everything the Masons got wrong.
Wow.
Right. Now, when Joseph and Hiram were visited by a high-level Mason when they were still living in New York, and this is yet again an apocryphal tale that the church tells, and the Master Mason, whatever they call him, the Grand Poobah, after speaking with them for a lengthy period of time, announced that they were already Grand Masters, the 33rd degree. There was nothing that he could teach them.
Oh,
and
boy.
So their temple is a Masonic temple. Their temple rites are Masonic. And so I think the listener, if they've made that observation, are probably closer to what's factual than what a Mormon believes about it, because the Mormons don't understand it as such. But now they're not
would
allowed
have
to
no
join.
clue.
They wouldn't. They would see, like, they are it goes for anything. If you show them Buddhism, they look for things that in Buddhism that remind them of Mormonism, and then say, see, we're the true Buddhists. They do the same thing with Islam. The Black Hebrew Israelites, them too. Anybody, you put anybody in front of a Mormon, they'll find one thing, and then that will reinforce them in the belief in which they've been trained, which is that they are restoring all things, and that all these things have truth in them, but they were separated from God during the Great Apostasy.
Okay. Now, the Great Apostasy, I assume that this is kind of similar to claims you find among a lot of Reformed scholars. Usually they label it with Constantine, St. Constantine, etc.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they push it back quite a bit further, though. So Mormons say that when St. John, when he was the remaining apostle, that was the end of the church. But that in order to get around, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, they believe that the Apostle John is still alive.
Oh, okay.
Now, he has not joined their church for some reason.
Yeah, well,
Don't ask them why. But that's what they believe.
I never knew that. That's an interesting point to bring up. I would be curious to see, to see what they say when you ask, is the Apostle John still alive? And that's very interesting.
They think he is. There's several characters from the Book of Mormon that they believe are still alive as well.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
They're just wandering the earth.
That's correct. They're hiding.
Wow. Okay. That is something I never knew.
Yes. But a lot of it's standard landmarkism. As you identify, and because this was the literature that Joseph Smith consumed, and it's just like, with the Millerites, the Millerites were publishing. In fact, at the first Millerite conference, I think there was something like 300 delegates, and over 151 of them were from the area where Joseph Smith lived. I mean, so it's hard. They will deny the connection, but I don't think it's deniable. And the same with the Church of Christ. Like, besides Sidney Rigdon, Orson, and Parley P. Pratt, two early Mormon figures, one of the brothers, Orson Pratt, made it all the way to Utah, where he, finally reposed. Parley P. Pratt was shot and stabbed by the angry husband of his 12th wife,
Wow.
in Arkansas. And, these were all Church of Christ ministers. So there would be no Church of Christ, without Mormons, and vice versa also. So they're all connected.
Now, the Church of Christ, that's the one that's like the restored Mormons, or?
No, the Church of Christ is part of the Stone Campbell movement, and they were a lot of Scots-Irish, religious men who came to the New World, and were on the frontier, which at the time was, Ohio. And, they started to teach like a return to primitive Christianity. And a lot of it was, and the same thing with Mormons, was driven by, because they're part of this restoration of the church movement too. A lot of it was driven by the frontier vision that, they're in this pristine wilderness. There's this minuscule republic that barely rules anything. Like it was a blank slate. Like they really thought they could make this, heaven on earth. That's what all these groups thought, and so that was kind of playing into it. But it was also a weird petri dish of like, because the disciples of Christ, they were called that at one time, the Church of Christ, the Stone Campbell movement, they did react to a lot of the more extreme expressions of the Restoration movement, especially like what today we would characterize as like the Pentecostal movement, the rolling on the ground, and so Mormons are that way too. Mormons have a somber service. They don't engage in a lot of no tambourine playing.
Yeah, no, I've seen one. It feels almost like a Baptist service, to be quite honest.
Right. Yeah. So they had similar ideas. So it wasn't hard for Sidney Rigdon and the Pratt brothers to come on over, but the groundwork for their conversion was actually laid 2 years before Joseph Smith came to Ohio from New York. Because in 1831, Joseph Smith was having trouble with a lot of his people in New York, because basically once he started to have all these visions, well, they were having visions too,
Oh.
And so he actually came up with a statement later, in 1833, that said, none shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church except Joseph, for he receiveth them even as Moses. That's how he cut it off in a doctrinarian sense. But in a practical sense, what he did was he sent them all on missions to Ohio, like anybody else who was trying to have visions. And one of those men, who was the second scribe, the person who wrote why he dictated the Book of Mormon,
Mm-hmm.
His name was Oliver Cowdery. So he had gone to Ohio in advance of this, smaller group of Mormons leaving New York and coming to Ohio, and had converted the Rigdons and converted the Pratt brothers. I mean, to the point that the Pratt brothers rode to New York to meet him in person and talk to him, this great prophet, So there's a lot of connections between the two. Something that's sort of interesting here in 2019 and 18 is the Mormon Church does not want to be known anymore as Mormon or as even the Latter-day Saints. They want to be known again as the Church of Christ.
Yeah, they changed their name or something, didn't they? Or tried to?
Yeah. They've had many different names. The ones that you and I, our generation, we're familiar with. You remember the commercials maybe when you were TV? There'd be like a feel-good little commercial, and they'd be like, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. Yeah. Right. So that's what but that's not really, they only did that because you would know who they were talking about. Like they were the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but now they've shortened it just to the Church of Christ again. So that's going to lead them into headbutting with this other group called the Church of Christ.
Yeah, the Ecclesia Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, but because the other group is so disorganized, which, they still fight about whether or not you should have a kitchen in a church. They're over there fighting about that. The Mormons are going to steamroll them on the name. That's a prediction. But yeah, it's the early history of Mormonism. Like if anybody wants to look at it, there's several good, books out there. Like, if you Google them, like if Mormons hate it, it's probably one you want to read. But none of this would have to be, like for your own edification, because no Mormon is going to hear this and believe it. They'll just be like, oh, I've heard this before.
Well, that was one of the most interesting things. Before I was Orthodox, I did some Roman Catholic apologetics, and what it's funny because one of the things that it was in one of Keating's early tracts against Mormonism, and he points to the fact of the existence of bees being imported from Europe, but because Joseph Smith lifted the passages from the King James Bible, the assumption is that the bees were in North America. But now that sounds like a great argument until I realize what you're telling me, which is that they'll just see it as a test. I mean,
wow. Yeah, it's funny. There's actually worse examples of that. So the Book of Mormon talks about horses all the time. Horses and chariots and swords and breastplates and shields and, I mean, of course, gold plates. But the Book of Mormon talks about rye and wheat and oats, and none of these things existed in North America.
Wow.
So the Fair Mormon website actually tried to make the case that that what the Book of Mormon was talking about was not actual horses, but a large South American tapir.
Really?
Yeah. So like these guys were like on chariots being pulled by tapir. Now, is that not some Lord of the Rings stuff for you?
It has a great visual to it. I mean, it doesn't sound very realistic, but it looks great. I'm just picturing these guys on the chariots with the tapirs pushing them and
yeah,
growling occasionally and stuff.
Like knocking over the the Israelites who were cursed brown, and having these war. I mean, like there was not that many people, but the rivers of blood and all these other descriptions of battles. I mean, it's fancy. It's just absolutely fanciful. But Mormons will, try to come up with apologetic reasons. But like we were talking earlier, Mormon apologetics is a very new thing. And Mormons in the past, like when I was coming up, like we would never attempt to like debate anybody. Like that was beside the point. We were supposed to look at it like, I'm going to hear some troubling stuff, and if I walk away and I'm still Mormon, then I passed the test.
Wow.
That was the there was no, but
so every doubt is a test of faith then.
Yeah, that's right. It is. And what it makes you do too, though, like the downside of it, the big downside of it is that it makes you susceptible to all sorts of nonsense because you spent your whole life believing in just something nobody else believes. So like if you're an adult and you're still doing that, now either you compartmentalize very well or you find yourself, very susceptible. Like if you are lucky enough to leave Mormonism, you find yourself susceptible to other cults, to abuse by people you're married to, manipulation and things like that, because you're used to like seeing something in front of your face, but hearing somebody that you respect telling you that it's what you're seeing is actually not true and it's totally different, and then you believe it and walk away. So there's real psychological harm, and if you want to talk about some of the other things that occurred within my years in Mormonism, I will, but that's a big one. Mormonism has made Utah one of the fraud capitals of the world. Because it's really easy for someone to get into the church and, just manipulate the group think. Like if I'm selling something and, I get you to buy it, I know all your friends are going to get it because they all want to be alike. And there was actually a case in Utah with it was a good sewing machine, don't get me wrong, but the problem was it cost like $3,000.
For a sewing machine?
Right. And so everybody had to have one, and it was free if they got 3 people to buy one. So like the con man went out there and he had every Mormon lady in Utah scrambling to find the credit card and then calling her friends so that would be free. Yeah. So there's times even where the Mormon church itself like has been taken in by forgers and people who were, deliberately targeted them because of their gullibility. But it's not that they're just like so distanced from the world that it makes them gullible. It's because they have to believe things that are just absolutely wrong, and so they're okay with hearing something that they know is, everybody's telling them, look out, that's wrong. But they're like, wait a minute, you always say that, and then you go on and you just lost all your money.
Wow. Now, I've noticed that in some more recent Mormon apologetics, they've tried to link their kind of their soteriology to the Orthodox view of deification.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that that's accurate based on what I've learned about, Mormonism. I mean, besides putting, even not even talking about the tritheism, but just talking about the whole, I think the way one of the missionaries said it was, it's like, as we are, he once was, as he is, we will be. And it's talking about God.
Okay, so what you're talking about there, how that entered the church was there was a young convert, and he wasn't even baptized yet. But his name was Lorenzo Snow, and he had that idea in a dream, and then he told that to some of the Mormon men, and they ran and told Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith came and talked to Lorenzo Snow, and he absolutely loved the idea. And so what he had composed there, for our literature buffs out there, I mean, it was a doublet. He made this doublet, as man is, so God once was, as God is, so might man become, or whatever. Anyway, so he composed this clever doublet. Joseph Smith heard it. He loved it. So then he gave a eulogy at a funeral that's known as the King Follett Discourse. So if anybody wants to, throw that in the Google machine, the King Follett Discourse, the name of the person being buried was King, his first name, and Follett was his last name. And so there was nobody who actually recorded Joseph Smith saying this, but there was a secretary who took shorthand, and apparently verbatim he repeated what Lorenzo Snow said. And then once again, that became Mormon doctrine. Before that point, the Mormons, the literature that survives, they appear to be average Trinitarians. So that changed the course, if you will, of like all Mormon theology right there.
Okay, now for those of us who don't know what that is, could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Well, as far as is their view, like they reason that that God has this plan. So they're Origenists. So like Origen, they believe in the preexistence of souls, and that God had an individual plan for everyone. And if they lived life as a faithful Mormon and carried out the ordinances of the faith, which sound a lot like our sacramental theology in Orthodoxy, that they would attain the celestial kingdom and eventual godhood on their own. And it wasn't to say that you would ever supplant our God, because he was going to go on to something greater as well. So it's nothing like theosis. I mean, here's a good question.
Yeah, it's like I heard you get your own, not your own planet, but you're kind of like your own
universe.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, so like just everything that God has, that's what you'll have. Okay. So, but the thing to ask like a Mormon if they're standing in front of you is because we believe that there are people who have achieved some type of theosis, right?
Yeah, unification with God, but we don't
right here in the flesh. Well, show me a Mormon that's done that, like in the flesh, because they're talking about something that happens when you're dead.
Now that's an interesting point. I never thought about asking that.
But they're not. You're not going to convince them. It's just one thing I would ask them. I have argued with Mormons. I still have a few Mormon friends who are, open-minded enough to want to argue with me, and they don't really have an answer for that, but they do like to, quote mine. But remember, once again, it's their mindset that they feel like they retain some remnant of Mormonism, and where they're wrong, they're just, that's the great apostasy. But where they can pick something up here or there, that's proof.
Interesting. So it's like a selective reading. It's like a selective reading of everything.
But don't be offended. Not only do they do that to the church fathers, they do that to Muhammad.
Well, I wasn't offended anyway, but the fact that they do that with Muhammad is terrifying. But I figured that was maybe the Masonic connection, that maybe because the Masons always had that whole building the temple concept.
Yes. Well, Mormons build temples everywhere. They're building one in Moscow. You know, that's what they do. They build temples.
Wow.
And they want the temple, of course, to be built in Jerusalem. But remember, the new Zion is right here in Utah. You know?
So they don't really need it.
No. But they think it will usher in the second coming. So, you know.
Well, how does the second coming work if everyone's getting their own universe and stuff? And then, you know, like, I mean, does the second coming...
they believe in chiliasm, you know. So there's a reign of Christ for 1,000 years, and then, you know, everybody like who is alive at the end of that is, you know, then goes on in the flesh to judgment. And, you know, those that are in the grave, you know, rise with a shout, and they are also judged. But their view of the afterlife, aside from a few, you know, lily pads that they jump in through the scriptures, you know, to arrive at the next weirdness, is that, you know, basically there's not really a hell. Like, so they'll use a lot of, you know, like Unitarian type arguments, you know, against, you know, the existence of a physical hell. The worst thing can happen to you is that you can end up in outer darkness. And Joseph Smith allegedly said that, like, you know, in his visions of like the various kingdoms of heaven, that if you knew how good it was in hell, you would murder yourself to get there.
What?
Like, yeah. So they don't believe that anybody's really going to any sort of an eternal torment or anything like that, but that the worst you can get to is this eternal separation from God, which they call outer darkness. There's no, you know, no visions of fire or anything, just darkness. And they quote a passage, you know, from the Bible that mentions the sons of perdition. And they've tried over the years to actually come up with a list of who they say those, you know, people are, you know, these various apostates and such. But of the degrees of heaven, you know, like they liken one unto the sun and one unto the stars and one unto the moon. And they go by the names of, you know, celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms. And only at the celestial level, if you've committed yourself to the ordinance of the church, you've learned these secret Masonic passwords and handshakes that you have to do with various archangels as you enter this kingdom, you know, then you take your place along with the women that you've been sealed to as your brides. And that's, you know, this deification process in the celestial kingdom.
Wow, that sounds actually almost like Islam.
We used to call it Battleship Utah, like Battlestar Galactica, Battlestar Utah, you know, or Battlestar Yahweh.
Wow.
Yeah, you're like pretty far out.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's we got a lot of information. I mean, even I'm processing here. I've never heard half the stuff you're talking about. I don't doubt it. I'm just amazed.
Well, the way the Mormon faith defends itself is, let's say someone says, you got to listen to this guy, Sean, you know, on Orthodox Apologetics Live. Is he full of crap or what? Your Mormon friend's going to be like, I don't believe any of that, because he doesn't have to. You know, what he's going to say is, even if I do believe that, what you need to realize is that I believe the church is true and Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. I'm out. That's what a Mormon's going to tell you.
Wow.
When you confront them with what I'm saying or what you discover on your own. And that's why I was, you know, telling you, Deacon, and also Bloodic Enoch, was it's kind of pointless to try to debate a Mormon. Like, they don't really respond to it in the way that, you know, a person dealing with reasonable faculties would.
So, okay. Now, so like these guys, I'm gonna, because I still wanna bug these firm Mormon guys and you know, pick their brains, but basically they're just not gonna. It's just not gonna process, or
those guys might, because I think that they're playing with fire. I mean, from a Mormon perspective, to begin with, the fact that they're even trying to engage in apologetics means that they're now having to read and, you know, compile information that's not a part of Mormon thought. You know what I mean? They're having to read church fathers. They're having to, you know, go over here and look at archaeology and then come up with an argument for why that's really Mormonism, and so on. So there's a good chance that of all of them, you know, somebody who is Mormon apologist is probably closer to leaving the faith than somebody who just gives you the canned answer. So I mean, it might work.
Well, I mean, it's worth a shot, and we're going to give it a try. For those who just coming in, we have Sean Ridlon here, a former member of the Mormon Church. He's an Orthodox Christian. How long have you been Orthodox now? Like 20
Well, I became a catechumen 4 years ago.
Okay.
Yep. And so I was baptized 2 years ago.
Okay. Well, glory to God for that.
Yeah.
And
so was my family, my whole family, my wife,
wow,
my kids. Yep.
Many years to you. That's awesome. Now, if anyone has any questions, please feel free. It's an interesting topic, but it does lead to it's interesting largely because of the fact that everyone sees the missionaries come to their door. It's very rare that you don't. I live in an area where I think that they're pretty far out, so I've only seen them in the past couple of years. But in New York, they were very common. But it's kind of funny because I mean, that they're odd in the sense that you're sending out basically kids who, because most Mormon missionaries, if I remember correctly, they're pretty young.
They're 19, yes.
Yeah. And they're not like exactly experts. So every time I've talked to them, I've found something that completely confuses or stumps them, and they're like, "I'll get back to you." Right. But the point is that it's interesting that they kind of take that approach. It's a very emotional method, at least for conversion, is what I found.
Yes.
Basically, you're praying for a good feeling over the Book of Mormon, and if you get a good feeling, then that's your proof.
Yes.
And that's it's I can't see that. To me, I'm still dumbfounded as to how they well, if you base it just on that, you'd be like, how do you form a religion off that? But then all the history and the confusing thought patterns and just all the crazy stuff, and it starts to make sense as to how it formed. But at the same time, it's like you boil it down to these teenagers who probably don't know anything about what we're talking about in this show. And we're talking about thousands. I assume it's probably thousands of kids in the U.S. alone.
Right, and that number,
really close.
Right, yeah, they are. And one thing I think you'll see as far as the future for Mormon missionaries is that you're going to see a lot more young women doing it. There's been kind of a movement afoot in the Mormon Church in the past decade where for my entire life and long before that, in order to be considered an eligible bachelor, you had to be a returned missionary. And a lot of these returned missionaries, as the age of marriage for the average American male began to get further and further away from 21, they would come back and be like, well, if I had to go on a mission, I don't see why you shouldn't have to. So now a lot more ladies are going. In fact, it used to be that a woman had to be 21, which in my day was like a Mormon spinster, Now they've lowered the age that the sister missionaries, as they call them, the female missionaries, they've lowered the age for them to go because so many more women are wanting to go. So we will see a lot more of them, and they'll be female. And that's a pretty strange thing.
Well, yeah. Well, that was one of the things that struck me as kind of odd because before I was Orthodox and, I was living not exactly the best life. What's it called? A friend of mine and I ran into two female Mormon missionaries. And we ended up having a fairly meaningless chat for an hour, at my friend's house. But then when I went to Florida a couple of years later, and I met some other missionaries, and of course they always they love talking, and I love talking, so I'll just keep talking to them. But I brought up these female missionaries, and they were like, "That's off the plan." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And they were like, "Female missionaries aren't supposed to go into men's houses."
That's right. The other thing is if you see female missionaries in an area, that means that area, according to the mission president and the leadership of the church, is considered pacified. So like Mormon missionaries, 19-year-old boys are in absolute ghettos, doing this. And but when you see the female missionaries, that means it's considered there's a large enough percentage of Mormons that it's safe, et cetera, et cetera. But no, yeah, they're not supposed to be.
It's like Mormon gentrification.
Yeah, it's like Mormon gentrification, exactly. But it's more like their attack plan. Like how are they gonna, get everybody in there? But I mean, interesting. You're talking here about missionaries. I've read somewhere that the average lifespan of a Mormon convert, in the church, so to speak, in the Mormon church, is only like 3 years.
Yeah.
So, most people who convert don't stay Mormon, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, different individuals for different reasons, but some of the main ones are that they never feel like they join it because there's actually like a class structure, like especially if you get out west, in Arizona and Utah and Idaho, there's you have the pioneer stock, and if you're a convert, you're not really on par. And
that was one of the weird things that I noticed. A lot of the missionaries themselves had families in Utah.
Exactly.
And so
yeah, you guys should do this. The next time Mormon missionaries walk up on your doorstep, before they introduce themselves, say, "How's it going, Elder Utah and Elder Idaho?" And just watch them they're like, "How did you know?"
I did not know that.
Yeah, every time.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because I can't help but think that I know the Amish, and it's kind of come out of left field, but follow me here with this. I think it's the Amish have this a spring awakening sort of thing. It's like a rite of passage where I think they get 3 or 4 months when they turn 18 or something, and they go out and see the world and stuff.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Sure. Yeah. But now what I've noticed is that for many of these missionaries, because they're young, it feels almost like they're kind of seeing it as almost like a camping trip, or it's I feel like the mission part is important to them, but also the traveling and see the sights and the world and stuff. It's kind of feels similar.
Yeah, I mean, only one of my siblings went on a mission. That's my youngest brother, and that was really his first time away from home. A lot of it's kind of like a boot camp. They attend a training center, what they call MTC, which is the Missionary Training Center, which is like their boot camp. They're taken through foreign language training, 6 weeks, and now you speak German, goodbye. That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And they're just drop behind enemy lines. And if they can't get anybody to talk to them, they're supposed to stand up on a park bench and just start, speaking French, about the Book of Mormon, whatever they can get out. And they hope that if they are dialoguing with someone, and this is one of the things about Mormon sobriety, they don't think speaking in tongues is rolling on the ground. They think speaking in tongues is I'm trying to tell you about Mormonism. You speak French, I speak English, but you're hearing me in French. So they don't believe that they actually have to learn the language fully to. So it's
I thought
a very quick thing.
I thought it was kind of hilarious. I was with a friend of mine, Father Alexei, when I was where was that? That would have been, I think it was. I think it might have been Vladimir, but in any case, it was a bigger city than Suzdal. But I forget where we were, but we saw it might have been Gatineau, but we saw these two Mormon missionaries, and I thought, this is the funniest thing in the world. I've come all the way to Russia, and here I am staring at Mormon missionaries. So I decided, let's go talk to them. So we go up, and the first kid, I'm like, so where are you from? And the first kid, in the thickest German accent I can possibly hear, says, "I am from America." And I realized that was a terrible German accent. But I'm sitting here, I'm standing here, coming, born and raised in Brooklyn, and I'm like, yeah, you're from America. I started laughing at him. And so I think he felt insecure, and he explained that, in fact, he had American citizenship from a military father and a German mother. And so I was like, that's a little bit misleading there, buddy, because I am from America.
Yeah.
But
Yad Amerikanski.
Yeah, so we had an interesting talk about, for about 5 to 10 minutes before we had to leave, to the amazement of, people there that were just fascinated by the fact that, I guess, an Orthodox priest and his bearded buddy were talking to two Mormon missionaries.
Mhm.
But in any case, that was it was an interesting thing. But yeah, so what I'm getting at is basically one thing we've learned from this show, and I really thank you for being here, Sean. Is that a lot of the difficulty in talking to Mormons is that they probably won't hear a lot of what you're saying. They'll kind of block it out.
Mhm.
But more importantly, their experience is generally limited. So I'd be afraid of, I wouldn't be afraid of talking to them. This is interesting. Devout Truth says, "I'd drink so much soda if I was an ex-Mormon." I don't know. I don't know if you're a Mormon or what that means, but we did establish early on that soda has generally they drink that. It can't be hot soda, but it can be regular, soda.
Well, like that's an interesting comment, because like I drink so much soda pop. If I drink water, I choke now. So I did exactly what he said, to be honest. And alcohol.
I drink a lot of soda myself.
Yeah, when I left Mormonism, I was off the farm for real. So
you were like, okay, I need cigarettes, I need coffee, I need alcohol, all in one thing.
Yes, that's exactly what I was like.
Wow. Oh, yep. Wow.
So like, I guess, maybe take a few questions, but you were talking about how to approach, like if you got a friend or, whatever, who's, interested in seeing what Orthodoxy is, keep in mind what they do typically is that they'd be very eager. They have no rule against coming and seeing it, so it's not like in Orthodoxy where if I go to another, if I go to a Baptist church or whatever, I'm confessing that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they don't have that. So they're okay. They'd be fine coming. They're going to be excited. They're going to be open-faced, wide-eyed. Remember that they are looking for things that you have that they can claim are remnants of their faith within your faith. But
they're going to go into shock.
They are. I mean, there's some things like, especially if they can see into the altar, and if they've received their endowments. In other words, they are a 19-year-old Mormon and they've been inducted into the temple rites. There's certain things that they're going to see that are going to absolutely just thrill them. Like when they bless their sacrament, which is purely symbolic, they're doing so underneath a cover, that covers their altar and everything. They're dividing the bread. They're not commingling the species, or they use water instead of wine, which is really strange. But where I was going with this is, one way to talk to them about what they witnessed, instead of being like, so what did you think of the true faith, and just leaving it at that, when they begin to tell you how wonderful it was, because they'll be like, that was absolutely wonderful. It was breathtaking. I love the icons. It was so cool to hear the chanting. The incense. Wow, I wish we used incense. They're going to say things like that. You just need to stop them and say, did you feel the Holy Spirit? Yes or no? Turn it back on them. You know what they ask you, if they have you read some passages from the Book of Mormon and they say, did you feel the Holy Spirit? Let's pray. Do that to them. Say, did you feel the Holy Spirit? Yes or no? And if they say yes, then ask them not to. Then you say, then don't deny the Holy Spirit. Because that's the only thing a Mormon thinks can really separate him from God. So if he feels something and doesn't act on it, that threatens his salvation. And that's the way.
So in other words, first off, on the show, we're never big on, I hate to use the term, the smells and bells, but if the smells and bells affect them, basically, that's kind of that's interesting. That's kind of using their own technique on them.
Yeah, then that's what I recommend for anybody who has a Mormon friend. Like if they say no, they did not feel the Holy Spirit, well, you can let it go. But if they say that they did feel the Holy Spirit, then you have them, because according to their Mormon belief, they now have to act on the belief. And you can say, well, what's next? Do you want to talk with the priest? Do you want to come back next Sunday? Do the same thing that they do, because they feel that that's the big weakness that everybody else has, because really they're just mirroring their own weakness onto other people. And so I would recommend that for anybody with a Mormon friend. Also keep in mind that apostolic succession is very important to Mormons. every Mormon Melchizedek priesthood holder will carry, generally in his wallet, but at least at home, a card that says who he received his priesthood from, and so on and so forth, all the way back to Joseph Smith. So they do have a belief in apostolic succession that,
They carry an apostolic succession list in their wallet.
A lot of them do, but everybody who's receives it will. They also receive like patriarchal blessings from a man called the patriarch of their local area, who's like a old respected Mormon who will like tell them what tribe of Israel they're from and give them like a special blessing that is like supposed to be the path of their life. So they have like these things that are like, kind of like Mormon legacy things that they keep around. The other thing is they do believe in the edification of buildings to the glory of God. So they are going to like smells and bells. They are going to like the nicer churches. It's going to remind them of temples, Mormon temples.
Yeah, I heard about that. I heard that, and this I heard from my wife, who was she was in Utah, and apparently, I guess like in the big thing, and so they have like a big statue of Jesus that talks.
Oh wow! I don't think it talked when I was a kid.
No, it's got like a pre-recorded voice, so it's like, hi everyone, I'm Jesus Christ, and it's like
you may remember me from such books as the Bible.
That's a great technique. Now here's an odd question. In theory, because Mormon missionaries work throughout the week, but Orthodox have services. A lot of churches have services on Wednesdays, on Fridays. You're never going to get one of these missionaries to go on a Sunday because obviously they're busy. But if you can get them in on a Vespers, do you think the same thing would happen?
They have an off day, and it's not Saturday or Sunday. Usually it's a Tuesday, and so like, if you have anything going on, so that's with missionaries. Really what I was talking about is if you have people like a Mormon friend, you know what I mean, or you're dating a Mormon girl or whatever. They've got some things, that they are generally very good people. They believe like in personal holiness and ethics and things like that. Like they don't like to lie or do anything like that. So, I mean, they're not bad people, and, they're friendly, and they're usually open to discuss the faith, your faith and theirs. So it's worth a shot,
but this is really more for like friends that,
yeah,
young ladies, etc. You need, okay. This isn't a good thing for many of our listeners, and but it's cool that you can actually use the techniques that they use in their own missionary work on them. It never occurred to me. I mean, it's certainly better than talking to them about bees.
Right. Right. Well, their whole life they've believed an alternative version of everything you're going to bring up. Like events from the early Mormon church, events from history. Literally, it's their own version every single time.
The gunfight martyrdom.
Yes, that's a great one. So, a lot of, for those of you who don't know, Joseph Smith was wanted for the destruction of a newspaper in which he was, the newspaper owner cleverly was allowing Joseph Smith to purchase space in the newspaper to rebut his own editorials that, the newspaper editor was writing against Mormons. And then Joseph Smith would pay him and and write this big rebuttal. And I'll come back to some other things that come from newspapers. But anyway, so
it's just funny because apparently he used the credulence you were talking about earlier on Joseph Smith himself. So that's pretty.
Oh yeah. Well, there was actually a time when Joseph Smith returned to.
Bishop Enoch is joining the stream. Benedicite. Okay, go ahead, Sean. Continue.
Well, so what I was saying is that Joseph Smith briefly returned to Methodism, in the late 1820s, after Martin Harris cut him off of the money, and when he did, a lot of the people in his area remembered him from a trial in which he was trying to bilk somebody else out of money for treasure hunting, and they said they didn't want a known necromancer in their church. So that was a lot of the reason that in the Millerites, in the 1830s, or why they left New York, was because of his reputation. So he caused trouble almost everywhere he went. And when they were in, Illinois and Ohio and Missouri, when they were in that area, this newspaper was in Illinois was writing these, attacks, and then he was paying and placing his rebuttals. So some of these became known as the Articles of Faith. Like the Mormon Articles of Faith, there's 10 Articles of Faith. They were actually things that he wrote to newspapers to try to explain himself. They weren't like written as scripture or anything. But Mormons believe them now. Like I said, anything can be scriptures because they don't have closed canon. So when he began to have guys like Sidney Rigdon following him around, who, like, when he first met Sidney Rigdon introduced himself wearing epaulets and a cavalry saber, and was like, "I'm your general." So, like, at one point, he's probably just this con man who knows it. And then by the time he has 300 or 400 people telling him that he really is a prophet, maybe he starts to believe it himself. And so he gets this idea in his head that he can actually order this printing press to be smashed, which he does, and he's wanted. And in his mind, he thinks, well, if I just show up for court, turn myself in, I'll explain to the judge how I'm the prophet of God, and he'll let me go. And so they go down there.
That usually works.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And so then he's placed into custody, protective custody, so he's allowed to keep his firearms, and so's his entire party.
Wow.
And then when the mob arrives, this is in Carthage, Illinois, they have a shootout out of the second floor. Of course, the jailer leaves. He's not going to die for this. And then, they shoot him. But that's the same thing when I mentioned Parley P. Pratt being killed by the angry husband of Parley P. Pratt's 12th wife. It took him 2.5 hours to die. Like, he found him in Arkansas because they had gone to New Orleans to try to, do some legal shenanigans, Parley Pratt and his 12th wife, because her kids were with her. And so the husband caught up with him in Arkansas. He shot him and then stabbed him with a Bowie knife. So in the 2.5 hours it took him to die, he said, "I die a martyr to the faith." So they is that a martyr?
No, that's
right.
Not martyrdom. Gunfights and stealing someone's wife and
for your 12th.
Now, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, Joseph Smith was something like mayor of Nauvoo City or something like that. Didn't he set up his own city at one point? Yeah, that's correct. He did. And in order to fund, for needful things, they actually worked out a land scam, and they created their own currency, and he got in a lot of trouble for that too. And remember, he had this 5,000 man Nauvoo militia, or the Nauvoo Legion. He had his own army at one point. So. That's right. So they call it the Missouri War. And during that period of Mormon history, they were in basically shooting battles with posses who were trying to arrest them for everything from bigamy to fraud, for assault, these different things that would happen, So they were in shooting wars with a lot of their neighbors there in Illinois, that mainly were coming from the Missouri side. But in Ohio, when they were in Ohio, he'd been tarred and feathered. So that's why they went down to the Illinois-Missouri border, and then it escalated to shooting. Mm-hmm. So, by the time the Mormons settled in Utah, that Mormon brigade got so large that President Polk actually enlisted it to go into the war with Mexico. That was one of the things they did. And there was also, I recall, during the time the Mormons, with the 90% that went with Brigham Young, basically, or 90+%. Yes. They had a group called the Danites that were in... the enforcers. Yeah, they were the ones that committed, the Meadows Massacre? Yeah, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Yeah. You want to tell people about the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Yeah, so the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred when a group of what the Utah Mormons called Gentiles, and that was a common term for non-Mormons when I was Mormon, was Gentile. This Gentile group of settlers attempted to cross through Mormon territory, so the Mormons decided that they had liquor with them and their worldly ways. And so they disguised themselves as Ute Indians, and they murdered the entire wagon train and stole the children and then adopted them into Mormon families. And when the United States government investigated this, that's how they figured out what happened, is they actually found the children that were placed in the Mormon homes.
Wow. Well, this is this has been a fascinating discussion of the history of Mormonism. And one thing I hope all our listeners take away from this is that it's a great technique. Vladika, you're just coming in. I don't know if you heard it, but Sean was explaining that when you're dealing with your Mormon friends, you can actually use that sort of emotional return that they use for conversion right back at them simply by taking them to church.
Now, is this the technique I remember growing up where the elder or the Sunday school teacher, the seminary teacher would say, just read the Book of Mormon and the Holy Spirit will tell you whether it's true or not?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So
now Sean was explaining. Well, you can explain, Sean.
Vladika, what I was saying was that, if you invite them to church, they're going to be excited and they're going to be open-minded and they're going to be full of questions. But if you just get to that same question with them, but ask them if the Holy Spirit moved them in church, yes or no. If they answer no, that's fine, that's honest. But if there's hesitation, they begin to feel that the Holy Spirit was speaking to them and now they need to act.
Well, I remember when I was a teenager and I encountered Mormonism. My father had grown up in Mormonism, but he later left when he was a teenager. I knew a little bit about it. And to me, that seemed, I guess, the argument about appeal to emotion. They would say, well, just read the Book of Mormon and what does the Holy Spirit tell you? How do you feel after reading it? Mm-hmm. And I remember replying, well, someone could read the Quran and maybe they feel good after reading that. Someone could read, any type of book. But I guess you're really speaking about you're appealing from their perspective, not logically looking at it.
That's right, Your Grace. Like what we're doing is we know their mindset, mm-hmm. and it's not going to work with somebody who thinks critically. But it works well with Mormons because you're asking them the same question that they would ask, because that's
that they grew up with,
right? That they grew up with. That's how they're going to evaluate the truth of what they've seen. It's not based on logic. It's not based on anything like church history that we can show them, or any of these things that we would typically argue in an apologetic setting. This is going to be about how did you feel.
Mm-hmm. Now, so Mike, I have a question. When my father I remember my father telling me years and years ago when I was a teenager that when he would go out with the missionaries when he was a teenager and they would go to different doors, door to door, they were taught to emphasize things that would sound similar to what the other people believed.
That's right.
So you wouldn't talk about the Heavenly Mother or the mother, God has a wife and things like that. You wouldn't go near that stuff until much, much later in the discussion. So is there a rationale that they try to, I think I heard, I just came on like no more than 10 minutes ago, listening a little bit. So is there a rationale in their mindset about why they have to, look at every religion and say somehow everything descends from Mormonism? It almost seems to be, like, I remember that Joseph Smith's argument for why he could adopt Masonic ceremonies was that, these are remnants of the old Temple of Solomon ceremonies or something like that. All right. So their religion is almost like perennialism to some extent, where everything kind of comes from Mormonism, and Mormonism can be found in all of the religions or something, or what?
It restores everything. Islam, Buddhism, Masonry, Christianity, everything. Yeah, everything is being restored through Mormonism.
It's essentially syncretic.
So now, one of the things I found interesting was, especially in the 19th century, I used to go to the library when I was a teenager, and there was the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, like 7 volumes or 8 volumes. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, Mormon, and you can go on Google Books and look up old Mormon periodicals for the 1920s, and maybe it's the same up into the 1980s. And in fact, it was, I think. But they would say that Christianity had been corrupted in the early centuries by importation of Greek philosophy. I heard this a lot. And they would use, for example, that the teaching that God is a bodiless, and that he created the universe out of nothing, and all these traditional doctrines of God, that God is divine simplicity, rightly understood, the immutable essence of God, things like that. They would almost say that these are Greek philosophical concepts. And Though it's interesting that if you look at, let's say, Greek paganism, especially the parts of Greek Platonic philosophy, Plato believed in the pre-existence of the souls, and he believed that matter was eternal with God. So,
Right.
which that's actually closer to Mormonism. In fact, Christianity in the early centuries rejected those doctrines explicitly.
Mhm.
It had a whole battle with not wanting to accept them. And so that seems to me, at least in an instance in which the early Mormon polemicists or whatever apologists either were just plain ignorant about the history of the church, just very ignorant, or they were deceiving people. And I don't know
Yes.
which one.
Yes and yes.
Okay. All right.
They
So,
don't have any conception
so what do you think?
until recently of
So in
any
your
of that.
so in your opinion, Sean, when Smith started all this, was he just kind of a con man who kind of came to believe it, or was he really deceived? Do you think it was demonic activity involved? What?
Well, possibly. I mean, he was in. I mean, really, and not to play the apologist for what Smith was up to, but you know, the area that he was in was a site. You know, so we're talking about, you know, rural New York was just like a hotbed of revival, and there was just every day a tent revival. You know, he heard preachers of every stripe. But he seems to be influenced by like folk magic and things like that, which is in his father as well. Like they got involved in like treasure hunting, which sounds innocent enough, but it was something that people did for money, a lot like dowsing for wells. So, you know, they would have these various objects that would allow them to locate treasure. He began to take money from a wealthy farmer named Martin Harris. And, you know, he claimed to know the location of this treasure, which he wasn't allowed. You know, when he would come back empty handed and Martin Harris would demand to see this book of gold, he told Martin Harris that first Martin Harris had to build this special box to carry it. So I could go through the whole history of that if you want. But the point is that he was very much involved in fooling people. You know, he was acquitted of treasure hunting and of fraud, but you know, he left town and immediately began the exact same activities. So I think he had it in him to do so, but he came up with such an interesting story that, you know, by 1830, when they first printed it, it started to attract a lot of interest, and I don't think he conceived of it as a religion at all at first. Because the religion was pretty much his father, his older brother Hiram, his younger brother, his wife Emma, and then the babysitter who he was having an affair with. And they started 3 different branches in New York, and those branches were constantly fighting. Like I was telling Deacon and the listeners that there, before 1831, people like Oliver Cowdery, who was his right-hand man, started to have visions of his own and try to publish those. And he had to put a stop to that. And so he sent the dissenters, if you will, or like the other ones who were claiming to have visions of God and things like that, he sent them west, where they began to create this cult of Joseph before he ever arrived in Ohio. And so by the time he arrived, he had somebody who thought he was a general. He had this council. He had these experienced evangelists and the Pratt brothers. And so he walked into like a pre-made religion based on a book that he may or may not have written.
Now, it's my understanding that there's also conflict between the vision, how he explained the visions he had. That, for
Absolutely.
example, that there's one which he says, oh, Christ appeared to him. Another, he says, God the Father with Christ. And
that's the first vision. Yeah,
okay.
That's right, Vladika. So allegedly that occurred in 1820. But the various accounts that he gave, and the accounts that he gave don't begin until more than a decade later. So the church claims 1820, but no convert for the first 10 years of Mormonism between then and the 1830s had ever heard of the first vision. But it's the first thing the missionaries will tell you about now. And so when he was giving these versions, you're right. Who was he speaking to? How old was he? You know, was he 14 or was he 12? What year was it? There was so many different versions. Online, I think I found something like 6 or 7 different versions.
Yep. And it seems that when we can objectively say, and I think it's pretty evident, that when you compare the Mormon account of whatever issue they're talking about theologically to historic records from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, obviously, we know that Orthodox Christianity completely trumps Mormonism. We obviously know that. That there is, you cannot look at, it's not reasonable to read the Apostolic Fathers or even the New Testament and get Mormonism out of it. So what is the Mormon explanation for the early Apostolic Fathers and how they conflict? Essentially, do they believe the apostasy happened like right at the time of the Apostle John and everything got corrupted immediately? Because it seems kind of ridiculous.
Well, that actually, Shauna mentioned that earlier. I guess the teaching of Mormonism is that the Apostle John is actually still alive.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, he is. That's what they say.
Yeah,
Right,
so
I'm coming in
he's
near the end of
wandering-
everything, so you probably covered a lot of stuff already.
Yeah,
Right.
no, definitely. But I thought that was really kind of an odd thing. I never heard that before. But apparently, they believe that various personages in the Mormon religion are still alive and, hiding away, wandering the earth or something.
But not participating in their church, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, if the Apostle John, if he just showed up, then that would help give them a lot of credibility.
It would, but would he be the president or would he be one of the apostles? Like,
Oh,
that's
Would he have to take over as the prophet in a gunfight?
Now, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, but that with the death of Smith, and I don't know if you covered this already, Mormonism split into 2 different branches, correct?
That's correct. It split. So Emma, his wife, and I may in the course of any of these retellings have minor details wrong, but her and his son Joseph Smith III, because Joseph Smith was a junior, they were against polygamy, but believed in like a succession from father to son. What they called the Quorum of the 12, which were Joseph's closest advisors, took a relative newcomer, Brigham Young, and they claimed that in a closed session of their council that he took on the voice and the countenance of Joseph Smith and began to speak to them, and that this was God's sign that he was the prophet, and he was an absolute Chad. Like you could see why they wanted to follow him. He probably answered every question they had, knew the answer to every question, like what are we going to do next? Those kinds of questions. So
Hold
Sorry,
on.
go ahead.
Are you, just to understand correctly, you're saying that the selection of Brigham Young was basically based on a Joseph Smith impression?
They say that he took on the countenance and the voice of Joseph Smith.
Okay.
So, like, apparently, yeah, I don't know what that means. They could have completely made that up, but that's what they say. So the thing is, Joseph Smith, while living, as Vladika mentioned, in Nauvoo, Illinois, he began to construct a massive Mormon temple made of brick. And when the Mormon church split, the group that stayed behind, which became known as the RLDS, retained control of the only temple that Joseph Smith ever attempted to build. And so Brigham Young was in charge of building all the subsequent, ones that came during his presidency. And Joseph Fielding Smith and Lorenzo Snow, who I mentioned earlier, he became a prophet of the church. And so these men all built, temples in Utah and in close areas to that. But the one that Joseph Smith built actually went to his widow, his only legal wife, the first one, and his son. And that's,
so what was the status of the whole King Follett discourse? Was it well known? Did people accept it? Did they not accept it? I know there's been all kinds of debates among historians about whether that was just made up, whether Smith actually said those things, and whatever. So what do you know about that?
Well, we covered it a little bit, but just to fill it in again, is the King Follett discourse was based on a doublet that was first told to Joseph Smith by a convert named Lorenzo Snow, who eventually became a prophet of the church himself. And Joseph Smith became so excited by it that he then he went and gave this eulogy, the King Follett discourse, in which he repeated it and then expounded upon it. But aside from a secretary taking shorthand, there's no other record of it being said. But it's generally believed that that's when Joseph Smith revealed this doctrine. But they believe in the doctrine of progressive revelation. So anything a prophet says is right.
It supersedes everything else.
It supersedes everything else. So before that, most of the evidence shows that Mormons believed a pretty vanilla Trinitarian type of idea.
So the King Father Discourse marks the point where they go from kind of maybe Protestant Trinitarianism, Sabellianism, maybe, to straight up polytheism. That's they have a. So that's the marking point.
I mean, I would say so as far as Mormonism, but because Mormonism sort of arose out of a petri dish of like these brand new American traditions. For instance, like the Universalists or what was called the Unitarians, that they believed like in a modalist type of a God.
Yep.
Some of the Campbellites believed in a non-Trinitarian God, even though they're Trinitarian today. So there was a lot of questions because there was this idea that we're going to return to the original uncorrupted version of whatever the church was, whatever their conception of the church was. But at the same time, the Mormons were over here saying, yeah, we want to do that, except we believe that God has a prophet on earth and his name is Joseph Smith, this very Islamic type statement. And so Joseph Smith, whatever he decided to say became, Mormon doctrine.
Now, have you covered in this discussion the origin of the Book of Abraham and,
No,
from the Egyptian scroll that really doesn't say anything like it says.
Right. So what the Egyptian scroll turned out to be, I mean, spoiler alert, it was really just a copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was a common grave good. But at the time, the Rosetta Stone had not been discovered. So there was no means by which people could. The problem was when Joseph Smith purchased a copy of this papyri, it was part of an entire collection that a dealer was traveling around trying to sell. He became very excited. He opened the papyri, he studied it, and then he announced that it was a form of modified, it was the same type of hieroglyphics that allegedly the Book of Mormon is in, and that he could translate it. And Reformed Egyptian. And so he asked the Quorum of 12 for a cash advance to purchase these papyri. They provided that, upon hearing his report. The dealer left very happy, although he did not buy the mummy that he had. And so then he began to pore over these, and then he began to dictate what he claimed were the contents, which were the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses, the Book of Isaac.
Pearl of Great Price.
Collectively known as the Pearl of Great Price. When I was a child, and probably also you too, Your Grace, when we were children, the standard printed version in English contained facsimiles of the various illustrations contained in the Book of the Dead.
Yes.
And so they were
trying to claim one was the patriarch Joseph.
Yes, it was. That's right. He was Joseph. It was Joseph on an altar about to be sacrificed, and beneath him were these various idols of the Egyptians. I don't remember all their names, but like the dog one that today we all know is Anubis. They said that his name was Kenai, like the peninsula in Alaska. Yeah. And so anyway, they had like completely labeled this whole thing so you could decipher it as a Mormon. Well, then come to find out, the Rosetta Stone is discovered. See, this was the fatal flaw, was unlike the gold plates, which were taken up into heaven, right. And metal plates with ancient inscriptions were nothing unique in 19th century frontier America. We all know of several different types of those that were claimed. Mm-hmm. This one they had a copy of, and they actually hung on to it. And so then they had to come clean about what it was. And so there's two main apologetical explanations. One is that what Joseph Smith the prophet was dictating was what God gave him to say. And it doesn't matter what was on the page. Okay, that's the official Mormon apologetics answer. The second is that he was completely making it up, and they don't care.
Really?
Yeah, so they're fine with that.
Now, that was what my father's conclusion was as he got to when he was leaving the Mormonism, was that a lot of stuff Smith said. For example, at one point, I think my father told me that Joseph Smith said something like there were people living on the moon or something. the kingdom of the moon, or they were, the different celestial spheres and such.
Yes.
And my father's view was that Smith said this because he never believed anybody was ever going to go to the moon. So he could say stuff like this, and who's ever going to know? He could have an Egyptian papyri, and up to then, people had made no success whatsoever in translating anything whatsoever. So you could just say whatever, and your guess is as good as anyone else's. So
Exactly.
a lot of it seems to be built upon, forgive me for saying it, well, maybe I shouldn't be asked forgiveness, kind of a confidence game almost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean by that.
Yeah,
he just
I do.
things, and everybody's like, oh, I guess he knows better.
And that sort of thing still goes on in Utah. I mean, to be quite honest, it's the area has problems with white collar crime that involves confidence. And when you're the bishop of your local ward, you can get everybody to buy your Amway products. Things like that are still very common. They're a very naive people because they're taught to believe all this incredible ahistorical nonsense. So why wouldn't they believe that this will get out any stain?
Now,
buy that.
I suppose a fear of mine is that people who are deep into Mormonism, it's not obviously didn't happen in your case, but there can be people who get so disillusioned that they basically turn to atheism. They just completely reject any religion whatsoever, and they assume everything is just as hollow and vapid and ahistorical as Mormonism.
No, that's what happened to me. Yeah.
Oh, that happened. Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't here initially. So.
Yeah. So like from 17, from the time I was 17 to the time I was 27, I wanted nothing to do because I was raised on the fact that the Bible was completely corrupt. There was nothing that we could not trust it. And so like in that way, they elevate the Book of Mormon over, the Bible is probably what they're really doing, but they do sow these great seeds of doubt in Mormon faithful that if they ever leave Mormonism because of problems they have with the Book of Mormon or the Pearl of Great Price or the Doctrine and Covenants or the racism or the sexism or the rapes or you name it, that they're left with nothing. And so for 27 years, I led a very, a bad life. But honestly, my doubt in these sorts of things, Vladika, began much earlier. And I hadn't talked about this yet. And maybe there's other people from a Protestant tradition that share this feeling. I don't know. But maybe it was just the way my parents expressed it to me. But there was such a belief in my house that when I turned 8 years old, that I was accountable for all my sins, that when I was a little boy, 7 years old, like I was contemplating suicide so that I could go to heaven. And when my younger brother, who was born when I was 5, when he was a little baby, I contemplated murdering a toddler so that he would not have to be a sinner like me, accountable for doing things like, lying so I wouldn't get a beating, and things like that. And so I recently was with my sister, who's 14 months younger than me. She's not involved in any religious experience or anything at this point. She's just an atheist. And I told her this, and she started saying, I felt the same way. When I was about to turn 8, I wanted to just die so that, I didn't have to, be accountable, and be unworthy. But I can remember being even younger, lying to my parents. Like if my parents were arguing, whoever could say that God had told them to do something first, they won the argument. And so I can remember picking up on this very young and then like manipulating my parents by lying about talking to God and even imagining it's experiences before I was on earth.
So it seems like a situation where the syndrome, you might say, of Joseph Smith gets passed down to all his spiritual children.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like not only are you dealing with credulous people when you're dealing with the Mormons, but you're dealing with people who are psychologically scarred.
Well, I feel like in my case I was, and I don't think I can put that on the church directly. Like, I don't think that was their intent. And my parents did the best they could. And my parents did not have religious upbringings. My parents were not Mormon. They were trying to correct their own lives, and so like, I don't put that on anybody, but just to say that those ideas are capable of leading to that. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not intentional, but that's certainly where it led me, was where I believed in nothing. God seemed to be like a comic book character. Like I could easily not believe in it because it was so hokey in Mormonism.
Yeah.
Nothing was real. And everything was up to whatever the charisma of the person telling you determined whether or not it was true. Like, how did they move me really determine anything? So it led me into, a lot of bad things in my life before I became Orthodox.
Well, I'm sure maybe you addressed this previous in the program, but if you look at the Mormon conception of Godhead, of divinity, it is almost comic book character. And what I mean by that is their view is that God is a man, God the Father, Elohim, was a man on a planet who just got who died and rose again, and he got superpowers. And he's a very powerful being. So he's a contingent being. All right. He's like the gods of Greek mythology.
Yes.
He's not an infinite, omnipotent. He's not how we conceive of God in the church fathers and the scriptures, divine simplicity. He's a transcendent yet immanent. He's beyond all comprehension, yet he can manifest himself to us. And so in that sense, the Mormon view, as I was understood it from my father taught it when he explained it to me, was that a God and man are of the same nature. All right. There's that. The only difference is that God is just at a much higher level. God the Father and the Son are just at a much higher level than us regular people on the planet Earth. So in that sense, when people reject the God of Mormonism, they are ultimately rejecting a false idol, something that's not really God, obviously. All right.
Right. No, that's
and
true.
And I understand your reaction is that, well, if that's who God is, then obviously that's not God. And but the result is that people aren't taught about the real God, who is beyond all these things. Yet he became man, and that's who Christ is. Okay, continue.
I was just going to say, Vladika, that like to talk about a comic book God, like does our God have legs? The Mormon God has legs because he walked in the garden in the cool of the day. Like, he has legs. He has a body.
He has flesh and bone.
Yes, flesh and bone, exactly. And
this is not a reference to the incarnation, obviously. This is a reference.
It's not, right. It's not that just
a reference to the divine nature. They're saying the divine nature has these things.
Right. Well, in sharing, if you will, in the incarnation, we are all conceived in the exact same way. We are all sent down from God, our spirit father, into our fleshly mothers, who are really our sisters. And and then we are brought into the world in the exact same way. Like, there's a very, very strange things going on in that telling that maybe on the surface to a Mormon do not seem weird, but even to a kid who thinks about it, they're like, wow, this is really far out. So for instance, like if I, as a Mormon growing up, was to meet a spirit. Now, keep in mind, they think that the third of the hosts of heaven that fell are simply human spirits who never received a body. They don't believe in angelic orders at all. There's no angels. Everything is either a spirit child or a fully developed God, right? So if I was to encounter this satanic force, this demon or whatever, like, how I would determine if what he was telling me was true was I would ask to shake his hand. Because if he was legitimately, of God, he would be a resurrected, like a John the Baptist or a Moses or an Elijah, and he would be able to grip me by the hand, and then I could trust what he said.
Because the demons were punished by not having flesh bodies.
That's correct. So, but think about the damage that could be done for a demon who we know from, the writings of St. Anthony and so many of our saints that can manipulate matter.
Yes.
Like, how many Mormons have actually met a demon who could shake their hand and then have believed what the demon said?
Exactly. So just to give a recap of of maybe previous parts of the program that I wasn't here for, what was it ultimately that brought you to seek out Orthodoxy?
That's actually that's Emil Surik's question. Yes, how did Sean become Orthodox, and is he an old calendar? So if you could give us a little background on how you became Orthodox, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah. So to answer all your questions on that, is basically when I started to feel a very strong need for an understanding with God in my life. I had, a bad life. When I left Mormonism, there were some good parts. I got married, I had children, I did normal things, but I was looking for something I didn't have, and the Bible seemed to keep bringing me back to it. I always enjoyed history. I'd been to the university and studied history. And my problem with the Bible is that I was raised to think that the Bible is the word of God so long as it is translated correctly, and nobody's ever done that. So I couldn't approach it. And as I had said earlier briefly, I spent a lot of times, even pre-internet, spending time and money purchasing and reading apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works that were, non-canonical, and trying to come up with, these quote unquote what they took out, and I believed those things more than I believed the Bible at that point. But I decided to ask myself, or to set a criteria, goalposts for myself, that if I could come up with enough credible evidence that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, but particularly died and was resurrected, that I had to believe the Bible, the entire Bible. Like, that was the pivot point. And once I had studied that one question enough, and I determined that, yes, it was true, that Christ was indeed risen, that now I had to join myself to his church. And that was really when I started to, because I had a background in history, I could very easily see that 99% of what was around me was not that church. But it didn't have the historicity. It didn't have the apostolic succession, the things that even as a Mormon I knew were important. So what I did at that point is I was very blessed. So even for all my problems, I lived in Alaska, where Orthodoxy was a common religion. And so I was able to narrow it down to two religions. Which one is it? I went to a Roman Catholic church. I went to an Orthodox church. And that's what happened. And so, yes, I'm in the old calendar church and am genuine Orthodox.
So what led you, when you were discerning this, what led you, let's say, to choose Orthodoxy over Roman Catholicism? Was it research church history, or what exactly put you in that direction?
Yeah, it was. I realized, that, Roman Catholicism was a contender, if you will, that they were an ancient faith. And then I went to Roman Catholic Church. I went to a few catechism classes. I talked to them. I talked to them about history. I talked to them about Orthodoxy, because at that point, these were on, equal footing. And just like by doing that, I was able to see that the Orthodox church in my town basically had a coat room and then a single room, iconostases with decent painted icons on the iconostases. Everything else was paper. It was very humble. Had one electric light. It was versus the Catholic church, which was 10 minutes from my house, which was, massive, with, felt banners, the chairs with kneelers, people in jeans and cowboy hats, once I got there, the strongest pull, I think, for Roman Catholicism for me was the fact that most of the clergy in that state were actually Benedictine monks that came to the state from Oregon. And so the priests were actually very, very traditional and very proper. The parish priest there was actually from Ireland originally. And, they were very kind to me. But when I would ask them questions about Orthodoxy, they always said, well, Orthodoxy is true. And I'm like, interesting.
Yeah.
So if you say Orthodoxy is true, then why are you
here?
Why am I here and why are you here? And they would say, well, go check it out. Or in fact, one of them said, we have a mission, that Orthodox mission that meets here, at 4:00. Hang out and talk to the priests. And I did. And then, but then I started going over to another Orthodox church. And, and then I came to the lower 48 here, and I was still going to Orthodox churches, and I went back to Alaska, and I talked to him and said, these are the problems that I have. Is there anything else you could tell me? And he just said, you should be baptized Orthodox. He's like, you should be baptized. He knew what had been going on in my life. I'd lived in that town for 15 years. And he said, you should be baptized, and you should be baptized Orthodox. So here I am.
And so eventually, though, it's something like, I'm sure the same path that led you to true Orthodoxy, so-called old calendarism, is that similar to many of us discovering of the whole ecumenical and modernist problems, I assume, right?
Yeah, we had a problem with that, even, when I was still in Alaska, it wasn't as bad, but when I came to the South, I came here, I lived 10 minutes from an Ephraimite monastery. I had gone to several different towns in Florida, met a lot of different Orthodox priests in World Orthodoxy. Some of them I think were, very, pious people, good people. And I started to go to a parish that had an Ephraimite priest. And, I was on the parish council. I was involved, at that level with, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And then we began to be persecuted by our bishop. And I realized that fighting from within only works so long as nobody knows you're fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And when they know that you're fighting, dear listener, you will be excommunicated. Your priest will be excommunicated if he's helping you. And that's what happened. But I wasn't excommunicated. I got away from it, but my priest was.
Wow. And this was in Alaska?
No, Florida, right?
This was in Florida, yes.
Yeah.
And, I don't want to tell on anybody, get them in trouble, but there are elements within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese who try to live this, engage in this guerrilla warfare. But like I said, it's only successful so long as they don't know you're there.
Yeah.
And when they do, they will get you.
The most successful form of fighting from within is when the hierarchy is on your side fighting with you.
Yes.
Otherwise, if there's real problems and it's the true church, you can solve those if the hierarchy is on your side. But if the hierarchy is not on your side, if it's totally given over to ecumenism or modernism, and you're just with a parish priest or some monastery, you're not going to win because you've already lost.
That's right. That's my experience too, Vladika. They're, what the rub was with the Metropolitan is that first there was in the parish there had been no proper baptisms in the Orthodox form since the inception of this parish 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so when the Ephraimite priest came, we purchased a large stock tank from the farm and feed store, and the first people to be baptized were a family of 6 that were Roman Catholics from Lake City, Florida. And then sort of word got out that we were baptizing people. We had a seminarian who was a sedevacantist seminarian, strangely enough. He was the oldest of 6. When he was in seminary and had learned to speak Latin, he began to see a lot of problems in what he was being presented as the church fathers once he could read it in the Latin, right, yeah. In the original versions. He had told his family about Orthodoxy and his intentions, and so 2 of his brothers and he were baptized. I was the godfather of one of his brothers. And then also there was a man my age who had been raised in Latin America, in Roman Catholicism. He'd been in Greece in the Navy and wanted to convert. There was another person who wanted to convert from Roman Catholicism, and that was also my godson. So I had 3 godsons, and they were all denied baptism by the OCA, by the Antiochians. These men drove a long way to come to us because our priest would baptize them. So we did. And I was their godfather. I helped with their, catechetical process. We talked about books. We, did things. And that's what was when it was brought up to the Metropolitan that's what we were doing. They very quickly cited the Balamond Agreement.
Yeah, the ecumenical agreements the FANR has to recognize non-Orthodox baptisms,
which are also, Vladika, also recognized by all major World Orthodox jurisdictions as well. But yeah, it was the FANR that originated it, and they moved to dismiss him on grounds of disobedience. And so he became a refugee at the monastery with his family. They turned off the internet. They turned off the power to the rectory. They would just walk right in the house, by this family he had 3 children and a wife who barely spoke English, and the rest of the parish council would just like use their key to invade their home. And this is when, he'd be completely disenfranchised in a foreign country over this. And so that is what there's no fighting from within. You guys, if you're doing that, you're fooling yourself, guys. Just telling you, you're not winning.
Yes. So, and that, of course, led you with the only option being true Orthodoxy.
I felt that I was Orthodox in that I knew people that were Orthodox, but that our bishop was not Orthodox. Our patriarch was not Orthodox. Many of the other priests were not Orthodox. We have Orthodox belief, but we belong to a church that is not Orthodox when we were in the archdiocese.
Now, there was, I assume, an Orthodox old calendar, genuine Orthodox church parish near that area. That's the under Metropolitan, not Pavlos, but Metropolitan Demetrius currently, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
And I was able to. When I say it's near, it's 2.5 hours away. And there's another one that's about 3 hours away. That's south of me, Camises, which is a very lovely cathedral. That's also a part of the GOC Kalinico Synod. And so my family and I, we drive. That's all there is we can do.
Yep. And I think that's important for people to realize that even people who want to go to World Orthodox parishes, sometimes you got to drive 2.5 hours even for that. So it's not suddenly like a big jump for a lot of people. I mean, of course, unless you live in Florida, I suppose, Florida's a big state, right? I haven't been down there.
It depends on which way you're driving, but from where I live on the West Coast to drive to the East Coast towards St. Augustine, it's 2.5 hours. But what the scriptures say, Vladimir, that we seek ye first the kingdom of God. If there's anything I would rather do than to drive 2.5 hours to receive confession and the holy mysteries, fathers, I have not found it. And anybody who thinks that that's too far hasn't found their faith.
Yes. Well, our Lord says, "And he who endures until the end will be saved." And
Amen.
a 2.5 hour drive is nothing in comparison to what people in history have had to deal with.
Yeah, that's right. That's one way. So I'm in the car 5 hours. It's nothing.
We're rather blessed that we have the only drive 2.5 hours. As to, let's say, like in Russia during the 1930s or 40s, where they had to walk, days to find some secret priest, to do anything.
Or Romania, find him in a hole beneath a tree.
You're right, like the St. Glacieri.
Yes.
All right. So it's I don't see any other questions. I may have missed one, but let's see here. We're going on. We just passed the 2-hour mark. So, in any case, since I don't see any questions, basically, first off, I want to thank Sean Ridlon for being on. We learned a lot about Mormonism, how to deal with Mormons, how to answer them, and maybe even how to see if we can bring them into church. If Vladika, do you have any questions for Sean or any comments?
No. No, I think this was a very informative program. I'll have to go back and listen to the first hour and a half or so, but I think
it's worth it.
Yes.
Okay, so in that case, I'd like to thank Sean. Thank you, Vladika, for being here again. Thank you for everyone who was listening, for family supporting this endeavor, and for all of you, for all your comments, questions, concerns. Feel free to leave the comments, and as always, like and subscribe if you want to talk to us more. We're on the War Zone on Facebook. Just check the link on the YouTube channel. And for everyone else, have a good night. Thank you. Benedicite.
Good night.
Good night. Okay.